Chapter 2. Harriet Smith. Harriet Smith lived at Mrs. Goddard's school, but Emma often invited the pretty girl to Hartfield. Very soon, Harriet was given her own room in the Woodhouses' home. She saw Emma nearly every day and listened carefully to all her advice. In the summer, Harriet had stayed with the Martins of Abbey Mill Farm. The farm was on Mr. Knightley's land, near Donwell Abbey. The farm was owned by Mr. Knightley, and Robert Martin looked after it for him. Harriet talked a lot about the Martins. She told Emma about the size of the farm, the different animals, and the kind Martin family. Emma noticed this, and she decided to find out more about them. "Mr. Knightley says that the Martins work very hard," Emma said one day. "Mrs. Martin, her daughter and son-in-law, look after the farm well." "Oh, Mr. Martin, Mr. Robert Martin, is Mrs. Martin's son. He is not her son-in-law," Harriet said, laughing. "Mr. Martin is not married. He looks after the farm because his father is dead. Mr. Robert Martin is a very pleasant young man, and he was very kind to me. And his sister, Elizabeth, was kind too." Emma smiled and thought, "Is Harriet interested in Robert Martin? Does she hope to marry him?" This was not part of Emma's plan for her young friend. "The Martins are good people, I am sure, but they are farmers," Emma said. "You are my friend now, Harriet. You are meeting the best people in Highbury. I am Emma Woodhouse of Hartfield. The Martins can never be my friends, so they cannot be your friends. You must stop visiting them at once." Harriet's blue eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, yes, I am sure that you are right," she said. "You have been so kind to me. I love coming to Hartfield. I understand you, Miss Woodhouse." Then she added sadly, "I will not go to Abbey Mill Farm again." Emma was pleased with Harriet's answer. "Good. Harriet, you must learn to choose your friends more carefully now," she said. "You are meeting real gentlemen at Hartfield. Mr. Knightley is the finest gentleman in Highbury. And Mr. Elton, our vicar, is a gentleman too. He often comes to dinner at Hartfield." "Mr. Elton is a very polite young man. He is handsome too," Harriet said slowly. "And you are a very pretty girl," Emma replied. "Mr. Elton can see that. He is very interested in you, Harriet." Harriet was pleased. Mr. Elton, a gentleman, was interested in her. Miss Woodhouse said this, so it must be true. Mr. Elton came to Hartfield that evening. Emma began to speak to him about Harriet. "Harriet Smith is a very pretty girl, is she not, Mr. Elton?" Emma said to the young vicar. "I have decided to paint a portrait of her. What do you think, Mr. Elton?" "I think that the portrait will be beautiful," Mr. Elton said quickly. "You are such a good artist, Miss Woodhouse. Anything that you do is perfect. I should very much like to see your painting of Miss Smith." Emma had begun many portraits of her family, but she had never finished them. She was now excited about painting a portrait of Harriet. She began the work the following day. Mr. Elton watched as Emma began to draw, and then to paint Harriet's portrait. He came to Hartfield every day until the portrait was finished. "It is a very pretty painting, Emma, my dear," said Mr. Woodhouse. "But in your portrait, Harriet is sitting in the garden. She is not wearing a shawl. She will catch a cold." Mr. Knightley looked at the portrait too. "You have made Harriet too tall, Emma," he said. "Oh, no, no," Mr. Elton cried. "This portrait of Miss Smith is perfect. Miss Woodhouse is so very clever." Then Mr. Elton added, "A beautiful portrait must have a beautiful frame. Let me take the painting to London for you, Miss Woodhouse. I shall get it framed there." Emma was very pleased. "Mr. Elton is in love with Harriet, I am sure," she said to herself. "My plan is going well. Soon Mr. Elton will ask Harriet to marry him." That evening, Harriet came to Hartfield for dinner. She was holding a letter in her hand, and she was crying. "Please read this letter, Miss Woodhouse," Harriet said. "I want your advice. Please tell me what to do." Emma read the letter quickly. It was from Mr. Robert Martin, and it was a proposal of marriage. Mr. Martin was asking Harriet to marry him. "What must I do, Miss Woodhouse?" Harriet asked again. "You must answer the letter, of course," Emma replied. "Yes, but what must I say, Miss Woodhouse?" Harriet cried. "It is a good letter. My answer must be well written too. Please help me." "Write the letter yourself, Harriet. Then I shall read it," Emma said. "Mr. Martin will be unhappy, but your refusal must be very clear." "My refusal?" Harriet repeated slowly. "I have to tell him that I cannot marry him, Miss Woodhouse." "Of course," Emma said. "You must refuse him. You cannot marry a farmer, Harriet. You are my friend, and I am Emma Woodhouse of Hartfield. You know that I have an important position in Highbury. I could never invite the wife of Mr. Martin to my home." Harriet did not say another word. She wrote a letter of refusal to Robert Martin. Emma read the letter, and it was sent at once. Harriet was very quiet all the evening. Emma tried to make her happy. "There is another man who is interested in you, my dear Harriet," Emma said. "I am speaking about our vicar, Mr. Elton. Mr. Elton is a gentleman." "Mr. Elton?" Harriet repeated in surprise. "Yes, he is in London now. He is looking at your portrait and thinking about you. He is in love with you, I am sure of it. You will soon have another marriage proposal, Harriet." Harriet looked much happier. She forgot Robert Martin, and she began to think about Mr. Elton. The next day, Mr. Knightley called at Hartfield. Emma was surprised when he began talking about Harriet. "You have been a good friend to Harriet Smith," he said, "and now I think that she will have some good news for you." Emma was very surprised. Had Mr. Elton been talking to Mr. Knightley about his love for Harriet? "Robert Martin came to see me 2 evenings ago," Mr. Knightley went on. "He told me that he loved your friend Harriet Smith. He was going to write to her and propose marriage. It will be a good match. I know that you will be pleased. I expect that Harriet will be coming here soon to tell you her good news. Mr. Martin has already sent the letter, Emma said quietly. Harriet has refused him. Mr. Knightley stood up. He looked very surprised. I know that Harriet is a silly girl, he said, but she has refused Robert Martin. Are you sure, Emma? Yes, I saw the letter myself, Emma replied. Mr. Knightley was very angry now. You saw the letter, he said. No, Emma, you wrote it or you told Harriet what to write. Perhaps I did, Emma replied. But I was right. Robert Martin is not Harriet's equal. No, he is far, far better, Mr. Knightley said angrily. No one knows anything about Harriet Smith's family. She is pretty and good-tempered, but that is all. She has only a simple education and no sense. She was happy to know the Martins before she met you. You have spoilt Harriet Smith by making her your friend, Emma. You have made Robert Martin very unhappy. Harriet may soon be unhappy too. Why? I have introduced Harriet to people from good society, Emma replied. She is a very beautiful girl. There is a much more suitable young man in Highbury who will be happy to marry her. Mr. Knightley was more angry than before. If you are talking about Elton, you are wrong, he said. I know that young man better than you do. He may praise Harriet, but he will never marry her. She is poor. Elton will marry a rich woman as soon as he finds one. You have made a bad mistake, Emma. You have made a very bad mistake. Good afternoon. Emma smiled as Mr. Knightley left the room, but his words had upset her. Emma did not want to quarrel with Mr. Knightley, but she knew that he was wrong. Mr. Elton brought back Harriet's portrait from London that afternoon. The painting had been beautifully framed. The portrait was soon hanging on a wall in the sitting-room at Hartfield. Every time that Mr. Elton looked at the picture of the beautiful girl, he smiled. Emma made sure that Harriet was always at Hartfield when Mr. Elton came to dinner. Mr. Elton was always smiling now. Emma thought that she knew why. It was the middle of December, but the weather was fine. One morning, Emma and Harriet walked to a cottage which belonged to a poor family. They were taking food to them. The road to the little cottage went past the vicarage. Harriet said that she wanted to see the inside of Mr. Elton's house. Emma laughed. You will soon be married to Mr. Elton and living there yourself, she told Harriet. Then I shall be happy to visit you in your own home. Harriet blushed. Her face became red, but she looked very happy. I am very surprised that you have not married Miss Woodhouse, Harriet said cheerfully. You are so beautiful and so clever. I am happy as I am, Emma replied. I do not think that I shall ever marry. Why should I? I have my own home and a loving father. I have money too. But if you do not marry, you will be like Miss Bates in the village, Harriet said sadly. People will feel sorry for you. Miss Bates is poor. That is why people feel sorry for her, Emma replied. I am rich. I shall be busy and happy all my life. My sister has 5 children, my nephews and nieces. When I am old, I shall be able to enjoy their company. Miss Bates has a niece, Harriet said. Do you know her? Oh, yes. Jane Fairfax, Emma replied. Miss Bates is always talking about her. I am tired of hearing her name. I always have to meet Jane Fairfax when she comes to Highbury. Her aunt thinks that we are friends. But Jane is very cold and unfriendly. I do not like her. By now, Emma and Harriet had reached the poor family's little cottage. Emma spoke kindly to them and gave them the food. Very soon, the 2 friends were on their way home again. After a few minutes, they saw Mr. Elton walking towards them. The young vicar smiled. Good morning, Miss Woodhouse and Miss Smith, Mr. Elton said, bowing politely. Let me walk back to Hartfield with you. If Harriet was alone, Mr. Elton might propose to her, Emma said to herself. Then she had an idea. As they came near to the vicarage, she began to walk more slowly. My bootlace is loose. I must tie it, Emma said. Please go on. Mr. Elton and Harriet walked on together. Emma bent down quickly and broke the lace. Oh dear, Emma called out. My lace is broken. Mr. Elton, may I go into your house? May I speak to your housekeeper? Perhaps she can give me another lace. Mr. Elton was delighted to help Miss Woodhouse. Soon they were all inside the vicarage. Emma went to see the housekeeper and left Mr. Elton and Harriet together. Emma talked to the housekeeper for as long as possible. Then she went to the sitting room. When she entered the room, Mr. Elton and Harriet were standing by the window. But after listening to their conversation for a few minutes, Emma was disappointed. Mr. Elton was talking about food, not love. That young man is taking a long time to decide about marriage, Emma thought to herself. But he will ask Harriet to marry him soon. I am sure of it.